Hi, welcome back to Safety Tech. In this video we're going to talk about the top 10 myths relating to CE marking of machinery. First of all, let's start with components. We have a lot of people asking us, where can we find wires that are CE marked? Or hydraulic pneumatic pipes, things like that. You don't need to get CE marked wires or pipes or any of those sorts of components unless they're safety related or fire rated or some other kind of rating, but 99% of the time standard wires are suitable. Second thing, domestic outlets. This is a big one. We have a lot of trouble with people talking to us about domestic outlets on machinery. See them all the time. If you're CE marking a machine, you can put an electrical outlet onto a machine for the purpose of plugging in tools or accessories or test equipment, those sorts of things. However, what we see are standard domestic outlets put onto machines. You can't do that. Yep, I know it's a problem. I know a lot of people are going to get really upset with this, but I'm afraid it's true. The standard 60204 and the low voltage directive both cover this issue. If you want an electrical outlet on your machine, it must comply with IEC 60309. Now you'll find that typically domestic outlets do not comply with that standard, and there's a couple of reasons why they don't. Everything in the workplace has to be compliant to a standard of some kind. If you have a domestic outlet, you run the risk of the operator's bringing in his cell phone charger, maybe a radio from home or something like that. A couple of things happen there. Number one, you're introducing equipment which is not certified, not tested and not suitable for use in the workplace. Secondly, there may be a ground fault or some other kind of fault associated with that component which could cause there to be electrical noise or radio frequency interference creeping up the power line into the machine itself, compromising the EMC certification of the machine. So that's a big no-no. You could get away with using an IEC connector, but typically as long as it is a 60309 certified outlet, you can use those, just not domestic type. Thirdly, let's talk about customs. Oh, this is a great one. Not quite the problem it used to be, but we still hear from time to time clients saying to us, we've got a problem. Our machine is on the ship heading to the EU, and we've just been told by the importers or the shipping agent that there's a problem with the CE certification and customs needs to see the documentation before they'll let it in. That's completely false and totally inappropriate and potentially illegal. Customs has no interest whether the machine is CE marked or not. In fact, there are plenty of cases where the machine would not be CE marked. Fairground rides, for example, certain specialist machinery, machinery for for trade shows and for training, incomplete machinery, government contract machinery. There will be many occasions where the machines are not going to be CE marked. Customs has no knowledge of these ins and outs of the European regulatory system, and they don't care. This is a myth, and typically what happens next is the customs company, the shipping company will say, give us some money and we'll take care of it for you. But I can tell you, it's a myth. Customs is not interested whether the machinery is CE marked or not. Fourth, the CE marking company that is doing the CE work for you must hold the technical file. Another myth. Now, in certain circumstances, some machines fall into a category called Annex 4, which mandates that the machines must be third-party certified by a EU notified body. In those circumstances, they will hold the technical file. Every other circumstance, which is classified as self-certification, you would be expected to hold the technical file. But we see all the time clients who have had CE work done before, they don't have the technical file, and so they don't know how it was done. Subsequently, they can't do it again. They must call back that same company to do it a second time, and a third time, and a fourth time, and so on and so on and so on. No, you hold the technical file, you're liable, the supplier is legally responsible anyway, so if you're supplying machines under the self-certification process, you hold the technical file. 5. Another good one. Certification for light guards or light curtains. This is a big problem, especially for manufacturers of light curtains who are located outside of the EU. Light curtains are covered by that same annex in the machinery directive I just mentioned, Annex 4. That means they must be third-party certified. It's a legal requirement in the European Union. Not so outside of the EU. You will find manufacturers who are located in the EU and outside of the EU selling both certified light guards and non-certified light guards. In the EU, they must be certified. So if you're a manufacturer of machinery and you're planning to ship your machine to the EU, be sure and ask your light guard supplier for the certification. If they don't give you the certification, it's not certified. Because one of the requirements of CE certification is that a certificate must always be produced with the product. This guard here, it's certified. Even though we sell them outside of Europe, we still send them with a certification for every single person who uses them in the United States. No problem at all. And 99% of the time, the manufacturers in the US do not have certification. Why is that? Guessing. This one costs 60,000 thereabouts to get certification. It takes a long time, a lot of work, but the end result is absolute reliability. That's the reason for the certification in the first place. So if the manufacturer in the US is not giving you a certification, either it's not good enough to pass the test, or they just didn't want to spend the money. Either way, you might want to ask the question. Now, most of the manufacturers in the US have a certified version in Europe, so ask yourself why you don't get that certification for yours here. Okay, what's next? Item number 6. Another one we hear all the time. You must send your machine to an EMC lab for EMC certification and testing. That's not true. Okay, so the EMC directive states that the machinery must be immune from radio frequency interference and not generate radio frequency interference at certain specified bandwidths and frequencies. And there are standards to test and prove this theory out. But this is where it gets interesting. Certain CE companies will encourage you to send the machine to them, or they'll come out with all their equipment and do EMC test work. Typically, that process is more expensive than all the other CE work combined. So very expensive, and typically equipment fails. The reason it fails is because there's so many other extraneous sources of radio frequency in the factory, lights, Wi-Fi, and on and on and on. There's so many reasons why it's a problem. So sending to a lab is usually the best way to avoid those problems. However, it's very expensive and completely unnecessary. The exception would be if you're manufacturing components yourself that might carry current through a circuit board, or you're using components that are themselves CE marked, but you're using them in an unusual way, not covered by that manufacturer's instructions, or you're just not certain that the way you've got the machine electronics arranged, the control panel arranged, or you're not sure about the grounding or the equipotential bonding, and so on and so on. If you're just not sure, then you might want to consider doing EMC certification. But under section 4.4.2 of the standard 60204, it quite clearly states that if you're buying components that are all pre-certified and you're using those components as intended by the manufacturer, that's called the assessment process, and you don't need to send it to a lab. That's another myth. Number 7. Risk assessments must be done to ISO 13849. Another myth, a huge myth. We are always being asked by clients to come along and help them figure out how to risk assess their machine using this risk assessment package that they bought, and they can't figure it out. And the reason is because they're using 13849. If that was the standard for risk assessing machinery, why do you suppose there's another standard called EN 14121, which is specifically for risk assessing machinery? Ironically, ISO 13849 does in fact say so. Inside it, it states that you should risk assess a machine to 14121. Now the standard EN 14121 has now been incorporated into ISO 12100-2010. Hasn't gone away, it's just been absorbed into another standard. The theory goes, you will risk assess your machinery using the principles of EN or ISO 14121 to identify the hazards, understand the hazards, determine the risk characteristics of the machine, and then decide what type of safety circuit or control system you're going to apply to control that hazard. Now if your system is going to be complex, involved, that's when 13849 comes in, because that's going to relate directly to the use of the components you're going to use in the circuitry. Now you can either figure that out for yourself, or you can call the supplier of the components in and ask them, explain to them what the risk assessment says, tell them what your ideas are for controls, components, wiring up, integration and so on, and ask them what they have that's suitable based on your risk assessment. They will be able to tell you, because they use and apply ISO 13849 to the components. So do you use 13849 for your machine? No. It's related only for the control function, the safety related parts of the control function. 8. Documentation for CE marks can be in English if the customer asks us. No, they can't. It's covered by the Machinery Directive itself. Whether or not the client wants it or not, you must provide documentation in the language of the country the machinery is going to. So if you're supplying to France, Germany, Italy, that's the language that the documentation must be in. Now, if your customer then sends the machinery onto another country, well then the responsibility is on them to provide it in that new language. But you must provide the documentation in the language of the country you're supplying to. You've got no way out of it. Doesn't matter what your customer says. That's how, with the exception of Ireland, of course. You must do it in the language that's common where they are. What are we at now? Number 9. The customer will do the CE marking for us, so we don't have to bother. No, that's not true either. Unfortunately, under the European regulatory system, the supplier is liable. The end. It doesn't matter what arrangement you have, it doesn't matter who's going to do what, you, as the supplier of the machinery, are ultimately liable. So if you contract the CE process out, that's fine, but you're still liable because they're doing it for you. So if I were you, I would not have someone else do it. I would make sure that you control the CE process to make sure it's done properly, because at the end of the day, you are going to be liable. So just be careful with that one. Number 10, lastly, and this is a big one. You're going to be very upset when I tell you this one. All the components must be in metric. Yep, that's true. I'm afraid it's not good news for most people in the US. Okay, that's because we have this thing called the Units of Measurements Directive, and it states that only SI units can be used. So if you're providing a machine with 2-inch bolts, I'm afraid that's not going to be legal. The reason being is because in the European Union they don't have 2-inch bolts. So if you lose one for reasons of maintenance, inspection, and the bolt is lost, they won't be able to get a replacement. So you will be forcing them to do one of two things. 1, use the machine with the missing bolt, that's illegal. Or 2, forcing them to modify the hole, drill it out, re-tap it for an equivalent metric one. That's illegal too. So for that reason, you must provide the machine with all fasteners and fittings in metric, so that if they lose a fastener or a fitting, they can get an equivalent locally without having to contact you outside of the EU to get a replacement part. So they're the top 10 myths. We may have more coming up later. But if you have any questions or you want to discuss any of those issues in more detail, shoot us an email, give us a call, and we'll be happy to do that. I know we've upset somebody somewhere, but that's okay.